At the southernmost edge of Europe, on the limestone cliffs of Gibraltar, archaeologists entered one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites ever investigated. The Gorham's Cave Complex, located where the Mediterranean meets the Atlantic, had already been recognized as a crucial record of Neanderthal occupation. Its interconnected caves, Gorham's, Vanguard, Hyena, and Bennett, preserve evidence of human activity stretching back roughly 120,000 years. But deep inside Vanguard Cave, researchers were about to encounter something far more mysterious: a sealed chamber that had remained inaccessible for tens of thousands of years. Before we go any further, please subscribe to the channel and help us reach our goal of 5,000 subscribers. Because what archaeologists discovered behind that ancient barrier would challenge everything we thought we knew about the Neanderthals. The discovery came after years of painstaking excavation. Archaeologists had spent approximately 9 years working deeper into Vanguard Cave, removing sediment carefully, layer by layer, while recording every change in the cave's stratigraphy. The work was led by Professor Clive Finlayson and researchers associated with the Gibraltar National Museum. For decades, the team had understood that the cave contained an extraordinary archaeological record, but nothing prepared them for what they eventually encountered. Their excavation reached a dense plug of ancient sand, blocking a previously inaccessible passage. It was not loose sediment from a recent collapse. It was compacted material that had remained sealed for an immense span of time. Eventually, the archaeological team began removing the sand. As the obstruction disappeared, the passage opened into a previously inaccessible chamber. The newly revealed space extended roughly 13 meters and had been isolated from the outside environment for tens of thousands of years. There was no ordinary pathway leading into it, no recent disturbance, and no evidence that modern people had entered the chamber before the excavation. The darkness inside had remained essentially undisturbed since the Pleistocene. Every object preserved there had potentially been waiting in place since an era when agriculture did not exist, permanent villages had not been established, and modern civilization was still unimaginably far in the future. For the archaeologists, the significance of the discovery became clear almost immediately. The chamber was not simply an empty geological cavity. Its sediments contained evidence of animals and human activity. Researchers recovered remains associated with lynx, spotted hyena, and griffon vultures. These animals represented different parts of the prehistoric ecosystem, and their remains provided clues about how the cave had been used and how animals had interacted with the environment. The walls also contained unusual marks, including deep scratches cut directly into the limestone. Researchers began examining each trace carefully, trying to determine whether the marks were geological, animal-made, or connected to human activity. Then came the object that changed the interpretation of the chamber. At the back of the cave, roughly 20 meters from the nearest beach, researchers encountered a whelk, an edible marine snail. The location immediately raised questions. The animal had not simply washed into the chamber from the modern shoreline. The cave's position and the geological conditions made accidental transport extremely unlikely. Someone had apparently carried the shellfish into the cave. That observation became one of the earliest indications that Neanderthals had entered the chamber. If the whelk was deposited there more than 40,000 years ago, then the people responsible could only have been Neanderthals, because Homo sapiens were not yet established in this region at that particular time. The small marine shell therefore became more than an archaeological object. It became evidence of movement, intention, and resource transport. A Neanderthal had apparently traveled from the coastal environment into the cave carrying food. The distance was small by modern standards, but the behavioral implication was enormous. The animal had been selected, collected, transported, and brought into a protected interior space. Rather than representing an isolated act of instinct, the evidence suggested purposeful behavior. The discovery forced researchers to reconsider assumptions about what Neanderthals were capable of planning and how they organized their environment. A different picture of the Neanderthals. For much of the 20th century, popular depictions of Neanderthals presented them as primitive relatives who were intellectually inferior to modern humans. The traditional story was straightforward. Homo sapiens arrived in Europe, possessed superior intelligence and technology, and eventually replaced Neanderthal populations. But evidence from Gibraltar had been challenging that interpretation for decades, and the newly accessible chamber added another piece to the growing puzzle. The deeper archaeologists looked into the cave system, the more complicated the picture became. Earlier occupation layers had already revealed evidence of sophisticated Neanderthal behavior. Researchers had recovered animal bones bearing cut marks, marine shells, stone tools, and other traces demonstrating that Neanderthals were exploiting a wide variety of resources around Gibraltar. The sealed chamber, therefore, did not appear in isolation. It formed part of a much larger archaeological record. The chronological evidence pushed the story even further back. In 2024, researchers reported evidence of a pit-like hearth associated with Neanderthal activity and dated to approximately 60,000 years ago. The structure had been designed for producing plant-based tar, an adhesive material that could be used with stone tools and wooden components. The discovery suggested that Neanderthals were deliberately manipulating heat and airflow to extract useful compounds from plant material. The process involved heating organic material under restricted oxygen conditions. Rather than simply throwing vegetation onto an open fire, the Neanderthals had created a structure capable of controlling the heating environment. The resulting tar could then be used as an adhesive, allowing stone points to be attached to wooden shafts. In practical terms, this represented an early form of composite technology, combining multiple materials to create a more effective hunting weapon. The technology also demonstrated adaptation to the Mediterranean environment. Instead of relying on resources associated with Northern Europe, the Neanderthals at Gibraltar used plants available in their own coastal ecosystem. They were therefore not simply copying a universal technique, they were adapting technological knowledge to the resources around them. That raised another question. How could such a complicated process exist without some form of knowledge transmission? Producing tar under controlled conditions requires more than accidental exposure to fire. Someone had to discover the useful properties of the material, understand that oxygen and heating conditions affected the result, develop a method for controlling those conditions, and then reproduce the process successfully. For that knowledge to persist across generations, it would have needed to be communicated and learned. The evidence, therefore, suggested something much larger than an isolated technological invention. It pointed toward accumulated knowledge, teaching, experimentation, and cultural transmission. A successful technique could be repeated by one generation and then passed to the next. The archaeological record preserved this technological history because the environment eventually sealed it away. Sediments, pollen, and spores became trapped within the cave system, creating a natural record of both human activity and the surrounding environment. What had once been an active Neanderthal landscape gradually became buried and preserved. The coastal world of Gibraltar. As researchers continued studying the deposits, they began reconstructing the landscape that surrounded the cave during the last ice age. The Gibraltar that Neanderthals knew was dramatically different from the coastline visible today. Sea levels were considerably lower, exposing a broad coastal shelf in front of the caves. From the cave entrance, Neanderthals would have looked across an extensive landscape of dunes, woodland, freshwater environments, and open coastal plains. The shoreline was farther away than it is today, and the exposed land provided access to a wide range of animals and plants. The archaeological remains reveal how extensively Neanderthals exploited this environment. Layers inside Gorham's and Vanguard caves contain mussel shells and the bones of fish, monk seals, dolphins, and terrestrial animals. Many of these remains contain cut marks produced by stone tools, demonstrating that the animals were processed by humans rather than simply accumulating naturally. This meant that Neanderthals were actively harvesting marine resources. They were not merely collecting occasional food washed onto the shore. They were returning to the coast, obtaining marine animals, carrying them back to the cave, and processing them there. Their environment was therefore not simply a place where they survived. It was a landscape they understood and exploited systematically. The prehistoric coastal ecosystem was extraordinarily productive. Herds of red deer and ibex moved across the lowlands. Birds occupied the skies, freshwater habitats supported additional wildlife, and marine environments provided fish and shellfish. Researchers have compared the abundance of this ancient Mediterranean landscape to a kind of Mediterranean Serengeti, but that world was not permanent. As the ice sheets melted, global sea levels rose. The broad coastal shelf gradually disappeared beneath the advancing Mediterranean waters. Areas where Neanderthals had hunted, gathered plants, and traveled across the landscape were slowly transformed. Generation after generation, the coastline moved closer. The open plains became smaller. Freshwater environments changed. The ecological conditions that had supported Neanderthal life for thousands of years were gradually altered. Yet the archaeological record shows that Neanderthals continued adapting. They returned to the caves, continued processing food, continued manufacturing tools, and continued using the landscape around them. And deep within the same cave system, they left behind another clue, one that would eventually become even more important than the shellfish. A series of deliberate marks cut into stone. Those marks would become one of the strongest pieces of evidence yet that Neanderthals were capable of abstract expression. And once researchers understood how those marks had been made, the discovery would force another major reconsideration of the boundary between Neanderthals and modern humans. 54 strokes that changed everything. But the story did not end with the discovery of the sealed chamber. As researchers continued working through the deeper layers of Gorham's cave, they encountered another discovery that would become even more important. Unlike the bones, shells, and tools scattered throughout the cave, this evidence was fixed directly into the bedrock itself. More than 39,000 years ago, someone had deliberately carved a pattern into the limestone floor. At first glance, it might have looked like nothing more than a collection of scratches, but closer examination revealed something very different. A deeply impressed cross-hatching design that appeared to have been created intentionally. The discovery was eventually published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and researchers described it as the first confirmed example of an abstract engraving made by Neanderthals. The distinction was crucial. Archaeologists had to determine whether the lines were produced naturally by geological forces, accidentally by animals, or unintentionally by humans using the cave floor for some practical purpose. If the marks were deliberate, however, they could provide direct evidence that Neanderthals were capable of creating abstract designs. So the researchers began testing every possible explanation. They examined the shape, depth, orientation, and arrangement of the grooves. They studied the surrounding limestone and compared the marks with known geological processes. They also carried out experimental replication studies, attempting to reproduce the pattern under controlled conditions using stone tools similar to those available to Neanderthals thousands of years ago. What they discovered was difficult to explain as an accident. The majority of the lines had been produced by repeatedly passing a pointed stone tool through the same grooves. The process required multiple controlled movements, with the tool being placed, dragged, lifted, repositioned, and dragged again. At least 54 deliberate strokes were involved in creating the pattern. That meant the person responsible had not simply struck the rock once and accidentally created a mark. They had repeatedly returned to the same lines, deepening and reinforcing the design. Somewhere around 39,000 years ago, a Neanderthal had therefore sat inside this cave, placed a stone tool against the limestone, and intentionally created a pattern. The individual would have had to control the direction of the tool, maintain the intended arrangement, and repeat the process many times. Whatever the precise meaning of the design, the physical act itself demonstrated planning and intention. The marks were not simply the byproduct of another activity. They were the result of someone choosing to alter the surface of the cave. That realization became enormously important because archaeologists had long associated deliberate symbolic expression with modern humans. For much of the history of archaeology, painted cave walls, engraved patterns, personal ornaments, and other symbolic behaviors were treated as signs of a cognitive transformation that distinguished Homo sapiens from earlier hominins. They represented the emergence of abstract thought, the ability to communicate ideas through symbols, and the development of cultural traditions that could be passed from one generation to another. The engraving at Gorham's Cave challenged that boundary. If Neanderthals were responsible for the design, then abstract expression could no longer be considered something that belonged exclusively to Homo sapiens. The discovery suggested that the cognitive abilities required to create deliberate patterns existed in Neanderthal populations as well. Their minds could apparently conceive of a design and then translate that mental intention into a physical form. Professor Clive Finlayson and his team were careful about what they claimed. The researchers could not determine whether the engraving represented art, a symbol, a message, or something whose meaning had been completely lost to time. The exact purpose remained unknown. But the uncertainty about its meaning did not erase the importance of its deliberate construction. The pattern was abstract, it was ancient, and the evidence indicated that it had been intentionally created. That distinction changed the question scientists were asking. The issue was no longer whether Neanderthals possessed the same kind of minds as modern humans in every respect. Instead, researchers had to ask which cognitive abilities were shared between the two species and which differences actually mattered. If Neanderthals could manufacture composite tools, exploit marine resources, process food in organized spaces, produce adhesives through controlled heating, use feathers as personal decoration, and create abstract patterns in stone, then the old image of the Neanderthal as a simple-minded brute could no longer survive unchanged. The evidence from Gibraltar was becoming a connected story rather than a collection of isolated discoveries. The whelk demonstrated that Neanderthals transported marine resources into the cave. The hearth showed that they could manipulate heat and materials to manufacture adhesive. The animal remains revealed systematic exploitation of their environment. The feathers suggested personal decoration. And now the engraved limestone provided evidence of deliberate abstract expression. Each discovery added another layer to the same picture. Neanderthals were planning, adapting, manufacturing, learning, and modifying their environment. They were not simply surviving from one day to the next. They were building a way of life. And that created a much more difficult mystery. If Neanderthals possessed so many of the behaviors once considered uniquely human, why did they eventually disappear? The last ones standing. The answer became even more complicated when researchers began reconsidering exactly when the Neanderthals of Gibraltar disappeared. For decades, the commonly repeated narrative placed the end of Neanderthal populations at roughly 40,000 years ago, around the period when Homo sapiens expanded across Europe. The implication was straightforward. Modern humans arrived, and Neanderthals vanished shortly afterward. But the archaeological evidence from Gibraltar did not fit neatly into that timeline. Artifacts and occupation layers suggested that Neanderthals may have remained in the region much later than the traditional extinction date. Estimates have placed the final occupation at the site somewhere between approximately 33,000 and 24,000 years ago, although the precise chronology remains debated. If the later dates are correct, then the final Neanderthals of Gibraltar may have survived thousands of years after Neanderthal populations disappeared from many other parts of Europe. Instead of being the last remnants of a species already gone, they may have represented one of the final surviving populations of Neanderthals anywhere on Earth. The scale of that possibility is difficult to comprehend. 16,000 years is longer than the entire span of many civilizations known from written history. 16,000 years ago, the last ice age was still underway. Agriculture had not yet transformed human societies. Permanent cities had not yet become the foundation of civilization. Written language was still unimaginably far in the future. And yet, according to the archaeological evidence, Neanderthals may still have been living inside these caves. That possibility changes the final chapter of their story. Instead of disappearing immediately after Homo sapiens entered Europe, some Neanderthals may have survived in isolated environments for thousands of years. Gibraltar, with its caves, coastal resources, and relatively favorable Mediterranean conditions, could have provided a refuge where the species persisted long after populations elsewhere had vanished. During those final millennia, two human species may have occupied Europe at the same time. Homo sapiens were spreading across the continent, while Neanderthals continued living in places such as Gibraltar. The two populations may have been separated by geography, ecology, or simple chance, but they belonged to the same broader human story. And then there is the Strait of Gibraltar itself. Today, the narrow passage separates Europe from North Africa, but its geography has changed repeatedly throughout the Ice Age. From the caves, Neanderthals could look across the surrounding landscape and observe a world that was gradually transforming around them. Their familiar hunting grounds were changing as climate conditions shifted and sea levels rose. Their familiar hunting grounds were changing as climate conditions shifted and sea levels rose. Areas that had once been dry land eventually disappeared beneath the water. For generations, the Neanderthals adapted to these changes. They altered their diets, exploited marine resources, manufactured new tools, and continued returning to the caves. But eventually, something changed that they could not overcome. We still do not know exactly what happened. Perhaps climate change reduced the resources available to them. Perhaps ecological changes fragmented their populations. Perhaps competition with Homo sapiens played a role. Perhaps disease, demographic pressure, or repeated environmental disruption weakened already isolated communities. Genetic evidence also demonstrates that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens interacted and interbred, meaning the disappearance of Neanderthals was not necessarily a simple story of replacement. It may have been a combination of many pressures acting over thousands of years. Imagine standing at the mouth of Vanguard Cave today and looking across the Mediterranean landscape. Somewhere in that same place, tens of thousands of years ago, a Neanderthal may have stood looking outward over a completely different world. They could have returned from the shore carrying a whelk. They could have processed fish with stone tools. They could have manufactured adhesive using a carefully controlled hearth. They could have worn feathers as decoration. And somewhere deeper inside the cave, one of them could have pressed a stone tool into the limestone and deliberately drawn a pattern that would survive long after their species disappeared. They could not have known that their world was approaching its final chapter. They could not have known that thousands of years later, archaeologists would uncover their footprints in the sediment, examine their tools, analyze their food remains, study the chemical traces of their technology, and stare at the marks they left in stone. But they left enough behind for us to reconstruct pieces of their lives. And the more evidence researchers uncover, the harder it becomes to describe these people as primitive. They were not simply surviving. They were adapting to changing environments, exploiting the ocean, manufacturing complex tools, controlling chemical processes, organizing their living spaces, transmitting knowledge, decorating themselves, and potentially creating abstract designs. The final Neanderthals of Gibraltar may have disappeared thousands of years after their species had already vanished from much of Europe. Yet their cave preserved something extraordinary. Not simply evidence of how they died, but evidence of how they lived. And that may be the most important discovery of all. Because the deeper researchers go into Gorham's cave, the less the evidence looks like the story of an inferior species being replaced by a superior one. Instead, it begins to look like the final chapter of another human population, one that possessed many of the same abilities, faced many of the same environmental challenges, and perhaps understood the world in ways we are only beginning to recognize. 54 strokes that changed everything. But the story did not end with the discovery of the sealed chamber. As researchers continued working through the deeper layers of Gorham's cave, they encountered another discovery that would become even more important. Unlike the bones, shells, and tools scattered throughout the cave, this evidence was fixed directly into the bedrock itself. More than 39,000 years ago, someone had deliberately carved a pattern into the limestone floor. At first glance, it might have looked like nothing more than a collection of scratches. But closer examination revealed something very different. A deeply impressed cross-hatching design that appeared to have been created intentionally. The discovery was eventually published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and researchers described it as the first confirmed example of an abstract engraving made by Neanderthals. The distinction was crucial. Archaeologists had to determine whether the lines were produced naturally by geological forces, accidentally by animals, or unintentionally by humans using the cave floor for some practical purpose. If the marks were deliberate, however, they could provide direct evidence that Neanderthals were capable of creating abstract designs. So the researchers began testing every possible explanation. They examined the shape, depth, orientation, and arrangement of the grooves. They studied the surrounding limestone and compared the marks with known geological processes. They also carried out experimental replication studies, attempting to reproduce the pattern under controlled conditions using stone tools similar to those available to Neanderthals thousands of years ago. What they discovered was difficult to explain as an accident. The majority of the lines had been produced by repeatedly passing a pointed stone tool through the same grooves. The process required multiple controlled movements, with the tool being placed, dragged, lifted, repositioned, and dragged again. At least 54 deliberate strokes were involved in creating the pattern. That meant the person responsible had not simply struck the rock once and accidentally created a mark. They had repeatedly returned to the same lines, deepening and reinforcing the design. Somewhere around 39,000 years ago, A Neanderthal had therefore sat inside this cave, placed a stone tool against the limestone, and intentionally created a pattern. The individual would have had to control the direction of the tool, maintain the intended arrangement, and repeat the process many times. Whatever the precise meaning of the design, the physical act itself demonstrated planning and intention. The marks were not simply the byproduct of another activity. They were the result of someone choosing to alter the surface of the cave. That realization became enormously important because archaeologists had long associated deliberate symbolic expression with modern humans. For much of the history of archaeology, painted cave walls, engraved patterns, personal ornaments, and other symbolic behaviors were treated as signs of a cognitive transformation that distinguished Homo sapiens from earlier hominins. They represented the emergence of abstract thought, the ability to communicate ideas through symbols, and the development of cultural traditions that could be passed from one generation to another. The engraving at Gorham's Cave challenged that boundary. If Neanderthals were responsible for the design, then abstract expression could no longer be considered something that belonged exclusively to Homo sapiens. The discovery suggested that the cognitive abilities required to create deliberate patterns existed in Neanderthal populations as well. Their minds could apparently conceive of a design and then translate that mental intention into a physical form. Professor Clive Finlay